started. So hi everybody, welcome to today's session. Really happy to see so many of you able to join. My name is Boudi van Schagen. I'm an agriculture and seed systems advisor at the Royal Tropical Institute in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and I'm going to be facilitating the session today. Share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. So today we're going to be discussing the topic of inclusive seed delivery, moving from diagnoses to testing. And I'd like to acknowledge that this webinar is a joint output of the Integrated Seed Sector Development in Africa project, which aims to strengthen pluralistic and market-oriented seed sectors on the continent, and also by the Seed System Development Program of the Netherlands CGIAR Partnership, which is administered under the auspices of the Netherlands Scientific Research Organization. And we also gratefully acknowledge the support of the Netherlands Food and Business Knowledge Platform in supporting this webinar today. And now I need to cancel my screen sharing. Nicole, if you're able, can you cancel my screen sharing? But I will continue in the meantime. So our keynote speaker today is Dr. Berber Kramer, who will be followed by two esteemed discussants, Dr. Joseph de Vries and Dr. Sylvia Sarapura, and they will be providing their own perspective and their analysis. And before I introduce the main speaker today properly, I wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded and you will be able to view it at a later date online, either at the Food and Business Knowledge Platform website or the ISSD Africa website. Secondly, as we go along, please write your questions and your comments in the chat box. We're going to have all three speakers speak, and only at the end we will have a session for questions and answers. We will then relay questions from the chat to the speakers. So please keep your questions as short and as clear as possible, and ideally identify whom you're directing the question to. If we have more questions than we have time for, we'll ensure that they are responded to in a document that will be shared with registered participants after the webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce the main speaker, Dr. Berber Kramer. Berber is a research fellow with the International Food Policy Research Institute. Her research interests are in financial inclusion, agricultural technologies, gender, and resilience, and with a particular emphasis on designing and evaluating innovative and inclusive approaches to strengthening agricultural insurance, credit, and seed systems. Berber also currently leads the gender module for the ISSD Africa program. So Berber, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Boudi, for those introductions and also for facilitating this. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Let me know if you can't see it. I'll make it full screen here. So yeah, this is a review that was done jointly with Emily Braley. She is a gender consultant with the World Bank and the IDB. And together we've reviewed the literature that documents different innovations in seed delivery, with our primary question being which models and which approaches for promoting quality seeds could make seed systems more inclusive. We started this review with the notion that, as many of you will know, advances in breeding and biotechnology have improved the genetics of the seeds for many locations in sub-Saharan Africa. But the improved seeds are often not reaching smallholder farmers. On the one hand, the marketing and distribution of these seeds to often remote rural areas faces multiple challenges, and many varieties remain on the shelf. At the same time, the delivery of these improved varieties is not necessarily pro-poor, and formal seed systems often come with many blind spots and biases. This limits the opportunities for a diverse population of smallholder farmers to benefit from the great process in breeding and biotechnology, from the great progress that has been made in breeding and biotechnology. So with that in mind, in this review, we asked the question, which models for seed delivery are both sustainable in that they improve productivity and incomes, in a way increasing the size of the pie, but are also inclusive in that the pie is divided equally between the women and men who contribute to agricultural production. To answer this question, we reviewed the literature on different approaches and innovations to promote the use of high quality seeds in sub-Saharan Africa. In our framework, in our review, to organize the studies, we built on two helpful frameworks from prior literature. On the one hand, we categorize studies in terms of seed security outcomes, distinguishing between studies that focus on how to improve seed availability, which means having the seeds available at the right location at the right time. Seed quality, which includes both physical properties, but also whether the genetic properties are appropriate given the user's needs. Seed access, which means that users have the knowledge, the information, the resources, and the mobility to be accessing the seeds. And use and control of the seeds, which is around the extent to which farmers have the right skills to use the technology, and focusing on intra-household dynamics that may impact how the seeds are being used, and also how the income from these seeds is being used. So a second framework that we use to categorize the studies in the review, which is zooming in on gender, distinguished between reach of innovations, benefits versus empowerment. So some innovations, they may have focused on enhancing the reach of seed systems or interventions in seed systems. And these types of studies would be reporting the number of male and female participants, for instance. Other studies will have gone a step further and focus on whether an innovation generated different benefits or had different impacts on well-being for men and women. And so then they may have reported different outcomes such as productivity, income, assets, with gender disaggregated data. And finally, we included studies that may have focused on how innovations could change decision-making dynamics within households. So studies focused on empowerment, whether innovations in seed systems delivery could reduce gaps, gender gaps in empowerment. And so in our review, the search brought up a range of innovations with several relevant approaches to promote the use of quality seeds. These innovations were spanning both the public and the private sector, with a bit more than half of all the studies actually testing an innovation in what ended up in the final review. Here we are listing these different approaches along with the number of studies and innovations that were included. Now, what we will find is that most studies analyze blind spots and gender biases in extension systems. 6 studies around extension actually focused on innovations in how extension is delivered. Another set of studies focused on seed subsidies, for instance, or resource transfers, and this includes seed vouchers, cash transfers, seed subsidies, different types of resource transfers to promote the use of quality seeds. Some of these were actually combined with extension. So sometimes we could group studies in one of 2 categories. We also found 2 studies that were discussing quality assurance, with actually only just 1 study testing an actual quality assurance scheme in Uganda. So that's on the public sector. On the private sector, we found fewer studies. A few studies were testing how to strengthen informal farmer-led seed delivery. Other studies were focusing on ways to strengthen the ways that seed companies connect with smallholder farmers, and how to make these efforts more gender inclusive. And we'll have Jo de Vries giving more comments on this as in his discussion comments. And then there was a set of innovations that focus on the intersection between financial inclusion and investments in quality seeds. It's important to note here that only a handful of these studies, although we started with the question, okay, what business models are actually sustainable, we actually found only a handful of studies, very few, focusing on this question and discussing cost effectiveness, or whether these innovations could be sustainable without external funding. There was very little discussion on this in the literature, so I just want to put that out there already. Other findings, and this slide is more around which seed security outcomes these studies looked at, and which gender outcomes were discussed in the literature. So this is for the innovations in the public sector. What we found, a few things that stood out. First, studies around extension, mostly focused on describing access to quality seeds and the use and control of these seeds, which also makes sense if we think about extension providing people with the information on how to be using the seeds, potentially generating increased awareness around the seeds, and improving access to complementary technologies that might improve people's returns on these seeds, for instance, promoting fertilizers, which could be grouped under how to improve the use of the seeds. Then looking at the bulk of the studies, they were actually documenting gender gaps in the extent to which current extension systems indeed reach or benefit women relative to men. So these were mostly descriptive papers that document whether there is a gender gap. But we found, so we found a large number of studies on this. And actually the number here, 19, is an underestimate of that. We found several more studies that we didn't end up including in the review, because we really wanted to focus on those innovations. Then when we focus on studies that actually tested innovations in how extension is delivered, and to what extent is this gender improving gender outcomes, gender was actually an area that didn't come up a lot. So on the one hand, we had all these descriptive papers that are talking about the gender gaps in the existing system. Then on the other hand, we found several studies testing innovations that were not as frequently discussing gender outcomes, and often focusing on, okay, does this intervention improve access? Does it improve use and control? But not necessarily focusing on gender outcomes. If they focused on gender outcomes, we generally found that gender outcomes that benefits for women were either equally large as for men, or that women benefited less from these innovations than men. So these innovations did not help reduce gender gaps. When we're looking at the resource transfers, for instance, seed subsidies, about half of all the studies reviewed focused on gender gaps in reach or benefits, and often found that these innovations did not help bridge existing gender gaps in access to quality seeds, or in the use and control over these seeds. Now, when we come to the area of quality assurance, this was a newer area. Gender was not discussed at all. And I think it's good to note here that for the range of innovations that we reviewed, very few, as you can see in this last column, very few actually reported data on women's empowerment or on agency intra-household decision-making factors that would fit in that last column. So this is highlighting some of the gaps in the literature. In the studies around private sector innovations, particularly around innovations in farmer-led seed delivery, we found more balance in studies that are focusing on all seed security outcomes, so ranging from availability in this table to use and control. But again, many studies were describing the existing systems and documenting gender gaps within these systems as diagnostics, rather than actually testing the effects of new approaches to strengthen farmer-led seed delivery and innovations, and documenting how these innovations could help bridge gender gaps. So there's very little discussion of that in the literature. When it comes to connecting seed systems actors, for instance, connecting seed companies with smallholder farmers, these were mostly guidelines, recommendations for how seed companies can connect with smallholder farmers and can make their efforts more inclusive, but not actually testing whether indeed this makes the efforts more inclusive, and whether we see larger benefits for women, bridging the gaps between women and men. So again, there was a gap. When focusing on financial inclusion, studies primarily targeted enhancing the demands for quality seeds by improving access to seeds or improving the use and control over seeds. But none of these studies analyzed gender outcomes. And ways through which financial inclusion can enhance women's financial autonomy and thereby advance gender equality also in seed systems is, we believe, a really important area for future research, given that literature outside of the seed systems area has shown how financial inclusion can help improve financial autonomy, and how financial autonomy has effects on different areas of life, which could include seeds, the use and control over seeds. Then a few examples of the studies, of the types of innovations that came up with this review. A really exciting example that we found in the public sector, whilst we found kind of discouraging effects of extension and limited reporting on empowerment. There was one example by Els Lecoutaire, Björn van Kampenhout, and David Spielman, whereby video-based extension messages were screened to both men and women, and screening this to both men and women instead of only men really had encouraging results on women's, not only on women's knowledge, but also on whether they subsequently trade their maize in the market. So a small knowledge intervention that had a large impact on subsequent outcomes across agriculture production and marketing. Then a number of studies on input subsidies, vouchers, cash transfers, etc. We found that either they do not close the gender gaps, or they do not report effects by gender. And we think there's a looming opportunity here to look at why gender gaps are not diminished. So what is the use and the control over income within these households? What is the use and control over seeds? And how is this influencing the effects or moderating the effects of input subsidies, vouchers, cash transfers? In doing that, it's important to measure gender disaggregated data, to measure agency, who takes decisions within the household, to better understand, using mixed methods, that decision-making process within the household. On the private sector end, exciting examples included guidelines for seed companies to start bridging gender gaps to be more inclusive. And as I mentioned, these recommendations have not been tested. What could be really exciting here is to actually test this and to measure cost effectiveness from a seed company point of view, in order to see from a seed company point of view, does it make sense? And what is for a seed company the return on this small investment of tweaking their current marketing approaches to be more inclusive? What is the return for seed companies? Are they leaving money on the table by not tapping into a market segment right now? So those are some of the exciting questions, I think, that can be asked here. A more holistic approach, perhaps, in improving agricultural productivity was the 1 Acre Fund. 1 Acre Fund addresses multiple constraints or barriers at the same time. And this includes providing seeds on credit, improved seeds on credit. In this approach, unfortunately, there is a randomized trial showing positive impacts of this approach. But again, as is becoming a common theme, there was no reporting on gender disaggregated impacts of this approach. And what we found in a lot of studies was that if there's reporting on gender disaggregated outcomes, there's a comparison of male and female headed households, but not actually of men and women in the same household. And given that the majority of households are male-headed in sub-Saharan Africa, most women actually live in male-headed households. So we should really focus also on those intra-household outcomes, gender outcomes. So in conclusion, we want to advocate here and make the call for more action-oriented research in which we work with different actors to get testing. With our starting question, what sustainable business models are also inclusive and promote gender equality? Along our journey of the review, we were, perhaps this is an understatement, a bit disappointed to see how little, on the one hand, the literature that is testing different innovations is documenting the gender disaggregated impacts on reach, benefits, and empowerment of their studies. Whereas on the other hand, there's a lot of understanding on gender dynamics in seed systems, but this is mostly descriptive and not testing, okay, if we change the way that different actors work together, or if we introduce these innovations in seed systems, how is this actually affecting women's empowerment, or how is this affecting gender gaps in the seed system? So that was a question that was just really looming large. So what is currently lacking? There's little emphasis, as I mentioned earlier, on costs versus benefits, so on the sustainability of these approaches, even though we kind of started with the question, okay, what sustainable business models are inclusive? We had to backtrack and say what business models are actually sustainable, and found very little evidence in that area, rigorous evidence that is showing these are the costs and benefits of different approaches. Gender disaggregated outcomes, as I mentioned, and a focus on decision-making and outcomes within households, considering that most of the literature focuses on comparing female and male-headed households. We found extension is still key in improving access and use and control over seeds, but without necessarily reducing gender gaps, even if programs were explicitly targeting female-headed households. And other innovations in the private sector, we often found that a gender lens was missing. And then on a final note, perhaps we could ask the question, okay, what is empowering? And it's important to contrast innovations in seed delivery with other livelihood strategies. Perhaps as we focused really on farming and production, perhaps that's not where the large empowering opportunities may lie. Perhaps larger opportunities for reducing gender gaps can be found in seed trading and other off-farm livelihood strategies. So those are a couple of the conclusions from the review. If you're interested, we're happy to share the paper. I think it should be online in the near future. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Boudi. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Berber. I think really interesting presentation, a bit of a sobering analysis in some ways, I think. And in a lot of ways, a call to action for all of us, I think, to do better. And on that note, I would like to pose the question you have on your last slide there to our first discussants. What sustainable business models are also inclusive and promote gender equality? And I would like to pose that to Dr. Joseph de Vries. Joe has a background in plant breeding and genetics. And since 1997, he's focused his energies on seed systems development as a sustainable solution to hunger and low crop productivity. Since the mid-2000s, he led AGRA's program for Africa's seed systems, the PASS program. And actually, since last year, Joe established Seed Systems Group, which is dedicated to developing sustainable seed supply systems in countries that have been left behind so far in Africa's emerging green revolution. So Joe, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bowdy, for that introduction. And it's wonderful to be with this group of people this afternoon. I see a number of people's names and faces that I recognize from past work, and it's great to be together to talk about this very critical topic. I'll get right started and try to outline what I'm going to say, or try to identify the points that I'm going to make. I'm going to first look at some data and relate some field observations, which I believe show that farmer crop yields have increased in a number of countries in the recent decade. That key to this progress in African agriculture productivity has been a new generation of crop varieties developed by a wide range of very dedicated crop breeding teams. And also, equally important, the emergence of a new, more effective and more private sector inclusive seed delivery model. I'll be trying to make the point throughout this discussion that when farmers, crop scientists and breeders, seed company CEOs, agro dealers, all the way down to extension people we call village-based advisors often, are playing absolutely critical roles in this emerging transformation of African agriculture. And then I'll make the point that with proof of concept of the value of this work in available from about 15 countries now, it's really time for us to extend the benefits of improved seed to countries that have so far been left behind. To start with, I think probably people have all looked at crop yield data, and it isn't all uniformly positive, but there are a number of crops in a number of countries where yields have increased significantly, whether we're looking at maize in Uganda, beans in Rwanda, cowpea in Mali, where you see a little bit more noise in the data, but that's probably because of the incidence of drought in the Sahel. But maize yields in Ethiopia have increased quite considerably as well. And I have a number of other graphs that show rice yields increasing in a number of countries as well. If you take a broader view and look at the countries where seed supply of the latest generation or the newer generation of crop varieties has been a focus of international assistance in collaboration with Africa's governments, you see that the crop yield trends for at least maize and rice are on a much better trajectory than in 15 other countries that we've also aggregated, where that this field of development has not been a focus. And so the point I'm making here is that if we're working in seed systems development in Africa, we really are working in an important field, and we should be promoting this much more widely. The efforts of the crop breeders has probably not received enough attention so far. It's really quite amazing to me as a plant breeder who's been working in Africa for over 30 years to realize that for most of the major food crops, for most of the agroecologies in Africa now, we have an improved variety that is significantly better, and in most cases, pretty well adapted to a range of different agroecologies. A lot of the attention, of course, is given to CGIAR centers who get the bulk of the funding internationally, but I'm well aware of some very brilliant crop breeders that working for their national agriculture research institutes, which we funded quite intensively during the past program, who have also come up with brilliant new varieties. The case has been made that these seed are not reaching farmers in sufficient numbers, and I agree entirely. I think it's also important to recognize that they are reaching farmers now in greater quantities than probably ever before in Africa's history. We can identify the breakthroughs that have been made, whether it's maize streak virus or other foliar disease resistances in maize, virus resistance in cassava, foliar disease resistance in rice, etc. And then also resistance and tolerance built into a number of legume crops such as beans, cowpea, and soybean. It's important to point out that all of these stress tolerance traits are now combined with higher harvest index, earlier maturity, which is often the most important trait for farmers, and yield under stressful local conditions. I mentioned that we feel like we're making progress in identifying the best methods for getting seed to farmers now. And really, this is kind of the seed value chain that we at Seed Systems Group refer to continually and continue to think about, which is more or less equally divided between a role of the public sector, if you include the universities and the breeding institutes, and then the private sector, which has really energized the production and delivery. And I'll go through some of these points individually, but I wanted to point out that when funding capacity building, and we need to do it for the National Ag Research Institutes more, if we have to have targets for women crop breeders. At AGRA, we always set the bar at 40%, but probably should have had it at 50%. But it was difficult to find 40% of cohorts and difficult to retain them until we realized that those programs need to have childcare facilities attached to them in order for women to stay in those programs, even if they become pregnant or even if they have children when they start their degree programs. Looking at the breeding revolution that's taken place, people talk about the new technologies that are being used to breed crops, but I always say the biggest innovation that's occurred over the last couple of decades has been testing the varieties under farmer conditions and getting gender balanced selection methods done by both women and men. And that this has really increased the accuracy of breeding in Africa tremendously. SME seed companies have been a big part of the innovation. These are companies, I went back and counted 26 CEOs out of the 112 companies that we worked with over the past past decade and more at AGRA. And that's about 23% of companies led by women, which is, I think, quite encouraging. These are companies that package their seed in smaller packages, down to even half a kilo if necessary. They sell and produce a wider range of crop seed species than multinational seed companies, which are generally just interested in hybrid maize. And they have a wider distribution. I wanted to give a shout out to a recent publication by CIMMYT, and some authors are mentioned there. Women in Seed Business in East and Southern Africa. It's a really interesting and quite encouraging read for those who are interested in seeing who these women are who are pioneers in the seed business in East and Southern Africa. At the farmer level, village-based advisors who are basically self-employed and activists for their community have proven their worth in a number of countries. And one of the main interventions they can promote is the distribution of small packs of seed of, say, 50 gram each, which allow farmers to test the new varieties at low or no risk on their own farm, and then come back in the following season and hopefully buy or find access to larger quantities of seed. And in the downstream mode, these people can also help to connect farmers to markets for sale of small amounts of surpluses. The important point here is that 100%, if you're doing the method right, 100% of farmers in each village should receive a sample pack. And if it's a self-pollinated crop, then there's an opportunity for a really sharp, careful farmer to increase the seed over year and become self-sufficient for that new variety. Agro-dealers are the last mile, and it's hard to say too much about them, but they have proved a very promising area of employment locally for women. I was just visiting an agro-dealer down on the coast of Kenya, and she was mentioning that most of her colleagues in the agro-dealer business in that part of Kenya are women, and she was very positive about the field. Unfortunately, I have to point out there that this work is currently limited to a select number of countries, and things are generally going better, and in some cases really quite well, so we've already seen in those countries. At least the trend is in the right direction, although there is still work to be done for sure. But what we at Seed Systems Group are pointing out is that it's really unfortunate that there are at least 15 other countries where agriculture is the basis of the economy, where none of this work is being promoted and where farmers still don't have access to improved adapted seed. And so we've collaborated with Cornell University in studying and traveling to those countries, studying their seed systems, and have come up with a plan for extending the benefits of improved seed to those farmers as well. And what has been quite striking as I've traveled in these countries is that in as much as there is very little breeding and seed production going on, what I really recognized was that there are extremely few women involved in those seed sectors. And so one of the biggest problems we want to correct when we do get the chance to go into those countries is increase the participation of women, because really at the moment it is not there. So just to review a couple of the principles that I think are important for gender equity and seed access, we have to recognize that women really are the majority of farmers and therefore customers for improved seed. Historically, we know they have been the curators of seed, even if it's traditional varieties, but also now of improved varieties. But they often lack access to cash needed for seed purchases. And so programs that increase their access to seed, as well as opportunities in the seed sector, are really needed. Thank you very much. I think my time is up, and I'll hand it back over to Bowdy. Looking forward to any questions that come up later.
Super. Thanks very much, Joe. Much appreciate your considered perspective and the contextual overview that you provided there. Please do keep the questions coming in the comments. If you have any comments or questions for Joe, please post them. We can get back to them in a few minutes. But right now, I'd like to introduce our second discussant, who is Dr. Sylvia Sarapura. Sylvia is actually an interdisciplinary academic and a professor in the School of Environment Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph in Canada. She has a lot of experience in the fields of rural planning for development, seed systems, transformative change, and agricultural R&D across Africa. And previously, she was also part of the Integrated Seed Sector Development Africa platform and involved in climate-smart agriculture and gender planning. So Sylvia, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Bowdy. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this excellent presentation, Berber. Well, I will focus more on the discussion from the results that Berber had, and it is what we should consider while we're thinking moving from gender diagnosis to testing solutions. And for the discussion, I will take the main takeaways from the presentation and focus on gender business models for quality seed. What are the considerations that we need to have in order to think about business models, and include also the aspect of gender planning and designing in business models. well, the main takeaways for me was how do we understand and contextualize business models? And Berber made it very clear. She said how we make this more inclusive and more gender equal and for seed delivery. Well, for me, it is by using the case studies that you presented and taking advantage of the knowledge that has been generating in different projects in seed systems with the support from the Dutch government and CGIAR. And it is selecting also best practices, looking at seed systems and value chains and who is involved in that system. Joe emphasized that women are participating in the seed system, in different seed systems. And well, we know by tradition that women around the world have been the seed keepers and they have maintained seed diversity for centuries. But what we should do and how we understand and conceptualize innovation. For me, this is important because we are talking about technological innovation. But why, if we are working on innovation and in order to implement inclusive business models, we should also think about organization, institutional, and commercial innovation. It is working with women and men in order to create better organizations. And Joe mentioned a lot about informal systems and informal women's groups. But what we do in order to have, okay, informal and formal institutions, but that support women's participation, women's decision-making in the seed systems. How do we understand and conceptualize gender in business models for seed delivery is also important. We have to consider that if the business model is inclusive, but when we say inclusion, we have to consider that we don't only look about participation, we look after representation, because when we go to a community or we work with a group of women, maybe these women have more financial capacity in order to participate in the seed businesses. But what about the woman who is a widow and has 5 children and she doesn't have the financial stability as the others? It is very important also to consider the women and men relations. Women as a diverse group, we always homogenize the groups and we say women, but what about the intersecting social aspects that characterize race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and maybe location of where the woman live or operate her farm or the business. And also important is, I know that it is a departing aspect that we have to consider about gender gaps, access and control over the resources. It could be that first step in order to work on inclusive business models, but we also have to consider on the root causes of the gender gaps, which are gender norms, traditions, and maybe culture, and what we can do in order to overcome these gender norms and transform the gender relations so women and men participate equally in the seed system or in the seed supply. But also is how we operationalize and measure them in the field. Well, we talk about indicators, and Berber mentioned that we have gender disaggregated data. I assume when she mentions about that, it is making use of sex disaggregated data, socioeconomic aspects that are very important, not only from the groups, but also within the households, which is very important. That we have to see the diversity, roles, and division of labor that exists within the household. And another aspect that is very important is how many women groups we have in our program. Are they supplying seed or are only involved in seed business management? What are the types of seed systems that they are involved? Could be informal, semi-formal, could be formal, working as Weber in the literature. She found the connection with big companies, and what kind of businesses are these? And what model is being used in the seed supply? It is formal, informal also. It is contracting or direct market sales, seed cooperatives, or women's association. But as I mentioned, it is important to consider that women, when we talk about women, the aspects of age and financial aspects are very important. And to finish, what I want is to say, we talk about gender inclusion, gender integration in systems, seed delivery. And for me, it is when we develop, and we have been working it with Gloria Otieno in Uganda, in the citizen science project, and also we have done some work in Mozambique with funding from the Dutch government in order to enhance the seed system sector in Mozambique. And we consider with the partners that in order to think about gender business, we have to look after the problem, what we have there, and to identify the gaps that were clearly identified by Berber in the literature review. For me, it is about social, or more exclusively gender exclusion. It is multidimensional because it has some causes. It is poverty, it is lack of education, as you mentioned. It is about institutions, it is about structures. And it departs from the household that we consider the households as represented by men, but women don't have participation and don't have a voice and cannot make any decision in relation to the seeds. It is intersectional, as I mentioned before, because gender doesn't go alone. Gender is influenced by other social inequalities that exist in society. And this is structural and institutional. It has to do with both formal and informal institutions. But, well, there are factors also that affect them. It is climate change. No, we are suffering more from climate change. The agroecological practices are very important for women who are starting their participation or their contribution to systems. It is about vulnerability, no? Technology. It is not only technology development, but it is technology adapting that technology to the context. Because what happens in the seed systems in Ethiopia, in Uganda, should be very different from Kenya, from Egypt. And there are also ways of including women, and Berber also mentioned about it. It is public, it is private, but also considering hybrids, as Joe mentioned. No? It is the inclusion of academia, the inclusion of research organizations, private research organizations, private extension services, and in order to achieve social and gender inclusion, for me, the core of the business models is how we program our projects and how we work toward our strategic objectives, what we need to do, a situational analysis. We have to do some surveys, household surveys, in order to understand the differences that exist in the community, but most importantly, to work collaboratively, work in participatory ways, because for me, the pathways of change are very important, so we can get some indicators, some quantitative and qualitative indicators, because the business model should maximize involvement, and we have to document the experiences, and we need data to influence not only the functioning of our programs and projects, but we also have to influence policymakers in the countries where we work. Otherwise, nothing is going to happen. And I want to be a little bit more aggressive. It is not only about policies, but it is about legal frameworks that guide the countries or that guide agriculture in countries. And for all of this, I think it is sharing experiences, piloting, having mentors, female mentors, and male mentors too. Men are important, and when we talk about gender integration in systems, we have to include men. We have to include men in the training. We have to help men to foster spaces that men feel comfortable working with women and including women in the work that they do. Agri-food fairs for me are very important. The case of Uganda with the citizen science approach, I think the agro fairs show the work of women and how they are contributing to diversity and also contributing to different seed systems. And an important piece of this is the theory of change. The theory of change has to be participatory. Everybody has to participate in developing the theory of change, and outputs, outcomes, and impacts should be very clear. Monitoring and evaluation, how we follow, how we know that our outcomes are achieved, and how we improve our program, how we deal with changes that appear from other circumstances. And this process has to be iterative, critical, and learning process, not only for people working in the projects, but for farmers. You build capacity of women and men by doing that, because they are involved in critical thinking, in dialogue. While you work in technical skills, you also work in soft or relational skills. Well, in order to achieve that, we need a social and gender inclusion approach, integrating gender from the beginning of the program. It is not, and I am glad that during the 3 years that I work at KIT, it was consultation and collaboration. It was not that you have to include gender at the end. No, we included gender from the beginning. And it is building capacities, individual, collective, institutional capacity, not only from the institutions or the organizations working or supporting the seed systems and seed delivery, but also from individuals. Extension, private, public, and capacity strengthening. Look at the context. The context is very specific, and you have to consider the socioeconomic aspects. Work with segmented groups, for example, considering gender, age, socioeconomic status. And the business models would be, as I mentioned, public, private, or hybrid. Look after the organizational and inter-organizational relations, the power dynamics. When I say organizations, it's any group. It could also be a group of people working in a household or in a community or an association. And it is the integration in the system, the structures and institutions.
So, Sylvia, this is Claudia. Could I ask you to wrap up, please?
Yes, well, it is diverse groups included in project, technical and soft capacities, technological innovation, business activities, scale out and up. And well, you will see here, I focus on some outputs and comes and a project level, what should be found and what you want to achieve, but also the impact level. Okay, Baudi, I think it is okay for me.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Sylvia. I think it was a really rigorous and deconstructed analysis of seed business models. So thanks very much for that. So that actually concludes our round of the 3 presentations. I hope that you found them stimulating and enlightening, and hopefully they've offered you a lot of ideas for thinking about testing, in particular gender responsive seed delivery interventions. We have had quite a few questions coming through the chat. I think we can categorize them in a number of different categories. It's very interesting, but I think what I would like to do is just to open up the floor to 1 or 2 participants to be able to pose a question. And I would like to start with, I think it's Ria Zadin. If you're here, could you just unmute your microphone and just briefly pose your question, please?
Hello, good afternoon. Hello.
Hi, Resident, please just go ahead.
Okay, my question is for Joe, where I heard in one point he's saying that the farmers can reuse the self-pollinated seed for the next sowing. So how come seed systems reach to a sustainable level when we promote saving the seed for the next sowing? This is for Joe.
Yeah, well, it's an ongoing struggle. I think, you know, for seed companies to be able to maintain business in self-pollinating crops. So what we found is that even with seed saving, there is a certain level of attrition just due to seed loss or mixture coming in, you know, to the seed that is available at family household level. And so it's not every farmer that's going, or farm family that's going to need new seed of a self-pollinated crop every year. But if the seed is on the shelf in their village, enough of them will come to renew their stock to keep that business going. A bigger problem in most countries that I'm aware of is supply of early generation seed for self-pollinated crops. And you know, that's now the main focus in the countries where seed systems have been developed. So a lot of times, if you don't see the seed on the shelf, you have to trace back to the supply of early generation seed, because most of the private companies do want to produce seed of beans and rice and cowpea, etc., but they often can't get access to the early generation seed.
Great, thanks a lot, Joe. I hope that answered your question. There was actually a question. Actually, it was a question around policy. I think it was quite interesting. Let me read it out for you. So this presentation shows again that while policies are supposedly strongly targeted to reducing the gender gap, putting policies in practice, so policy implementation, is still, you know, a big gap. So do we think this is going to change? Who would like to respond to that question? Maybe Berber.
Yeah, I can say a few things on that. I think indeed we've been talking although seed systems research is a relatively newer area of work, we've been talking for quite a while about how there's gaps and how seed systems aren't inclusive. And it seems like there's progress being made, as also shown by Joe in the 15 or in the countries where seed systems were more developed, but it's not yet enough. And I think part of this is also that the evidence on what actually works isn't there. It's not being documented. I think the examples that Joe was showing are really, I think they're really interesting, and they sound really promising. And for instance, in work in Kenya, we are also testing the model of village-based advisors, providing seed packs, trial packs, in order to quantify from a seed company perspective, what is the cost effectiveness? From a policy perspective, what are the social impacts? But the examples that we see on, okay, we think this works or we think this works, it's not documented in the literature. So it's difficult to go to a policymaker and to say, here's an approach, we've tested it, the cost benefit of this approach is, say, for every dollar that you invest, you earn $5 back that you can put back into the seed system. That evidence just isn't there. And so I think we just need to focus much more on generating that evidence so that policymakers can act on quantified, rigorous evidence. Because it's difficult to change the way that you operate based on success stories without the evidence behind it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. I think we've got time for one more question, and I would like to propose Cornelis. I think you had a question. Would you like to pose this to Joe?
Yes, hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I think you mean Cornelis with me. My name is Kees Swaans. I'm working on a project on seed systems in Vietnam, and we are especially looking at what the effect is of the introduction of new varieties on biodiversity locally. And I was wondering whether you have any data or any insights how the introduction of new varieties, how that affects local biodiversity, and especially in relation to varieties or local varieties relevant to nutrition. Have you ever looked at that, or do you have data on that? I'm just wondering because we want to explore that further. So,
yeah, I think you know, it's good to measure what the introduction of a supposedly improved variety does to the availability or the stock of local land races, for example. And there's an important role, of course, for the public sector in there to keep stocks of traditional land races and for future use. Even if they may go out of use in the short run, they could still be needed for a breeding program or even for use by farmers. But what we found as well, I think you'll probably see if you haven't already, is that farmers rarely give up 100% of their varieties just to grow an improved variety. In fact, in many cases, you'll find farmers are growing several varieties, one that they may prefer for their own use and another that they grow for the market. And so I think there's, you know, good cause to trust farmers to do the right thing in keeping the valuable genetic resources at their disposal. But I do believe it is an important thing to study.
Yeah, I think in terms, because I was several years ago, I was involved in a program from Oxfam, which was also focused more on participatory breeding. So in terms of local varieties which were regenerated, whether we can actually improve quality of local varieties. So by including local farmers in breeding programs with a specific focus on women. So actually could fit actually quite well in this discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, a lot of the newer varieties that come out of participatory breeding aren't all new. You know, they've kept a lot of the traits that are important to local farmers. And so they may have higher yield, hopefully. Hopefully they have earlier maturity. Those are traits that are really important to farmers who want to intensify their productivity and help us end hunger. But if they've also kept, you know, an important trait that relates to how food is prepared at the village level, that's a good thing, you know. And if it can't be captured if you don't get farmer input. So farmer participation in the selection of the best varieties absolutely critical. And I'm happy to see it going on. It's costly, you know, it doesn't come free. You have to have funds to do that work. And so that's why we advocate for, you know, adequate funding going to national ag research institutes, even if they're not doing creation of new varieties completely from scratch. They still have the responsibility for testing a wide array of improved varieties that have been introduced to the country, and they can't do it without funding.
Thanks very much, Joe. Much appreciate the response.
Can I make one last remark?
I would like to offer. Sorry, Kees.
No, I just wanted to make a last remark because I think a lot of the examples are from Africa, and just a remark. It would be quite interesting actually to see to what extent the different cultures. I think, especially between, well, I know for Southeast Asia compared to which has a different kind of system, a natural agricultural research system, compared to Africa. So I think that could be interesting to look at, but it's just a remark from my side.
Absolutely.
Definitely interesting point. The review was indeed focused on Sub-Saharan Africa because it was done in the context of the ISSD Africa program. But it would be interesting to see how gender norms are different across contexts and how this is influencing the outcomes from different approaches.
Thanks.
All right, one more time for one last question. And Solomon, I think you had a question about chicken seed systems, essentially. Do you want to pose that question?
Yes, thank you. Just all the presentations are focusing on the crop side, so I would like to hear the view of the presenters on seed systems in chicken, particularly improved chicken.
Who would you like to respond to your question in particular?
Just any one of them.
Barbara, could I ask you to respond?
Yes, so we didn't deliberately exclude studies on chicken. So when we talk about seeds, we talk about seeds in their broader meaning, including also advances in the genetic materials that go in breeding of chicken or livestock fisheries. We found fewer studies in that area. I think like most of the hits that we were finding through the literature was focused on crops. I think that's showing where a lot of the investment goes. I think there's a lot of interesting work ongoing now on understanding the seed systems also in the chicken value chain or poultry. And some of the innovations are, I think all the innovations that we reviewed in the literature can also be applicable in the poultry chain, even if we did not find literature specifically on that. So if we're looking at extension, vouchers, cash transfers, all these innovations can be directed also to promote the use of quality materials and quality seeds in the poultry chain. I think what's important to consider is that every value chain comes with its own gender norms and gender context. And so innovations that might work in improving gender inclusiveness in a crop value chain might not work in a poultry value chain, or perhaps there's greater opportunities in poultry chains. So these are some of the questions that we are hoping to get at in more a meta-analysis or a review of different seed systems interventions that are currently ongoing with funding from the Dutch government. There's a range of different commodities included, and several of these projects are looking at women-led business models for the promotion of these high-quality seeds. So there's a study on fisheries, there's a study on poultry, there's a study on crops. So we hope to get at more, in synthesis work, we hope to get more at those types of questions. So I hope this answers your question, Solomon.
Super, thanks very much for that response, Barbara. We're now out of time. So what I propose to do is to have the remaining questions answered by the panel in a document that we will circulate to all registered participants in a few days' time. So I'll make sure we get all of those questions answered and responded to. And I guess that all that remains for me is just to say a really big thanks to our three presenters, Barbara Kramer, Joe de Vries, Sylvia Sarapura. Thank you so much. Thanks to all participants for your interest, for your engagement and your questions. We hope you found the presentations interesting and the discussions thought-provoking. So thanks a lot for joining, and goodbye. Looking forward to seeing you.